Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So now that the RG351M is out, a lot of people are asking questions about how it compares to the RG351P. And in my RG351M unboxing video, I talked a little bit about it, but today I want to actually do a deep dive where we talk about the specific differences between the RG351M and the RG351P. When it comes down to it, the only fundamental differences between these two devices is that the RG351M has built-in Wi-Fi and it has a metal shell. But we will get into those details and talk about some of the little nuances that are a bit different as well. So if you're on the fence and can't decide between the RG351P or the RG351M, I'm hoping that this guide will help you. So without any further delay, let's jump into it. So right off the bat, let's talk about different specs. Now both devices use the exact same chipset, which is the RK3326, which can reach a clock speed of up to 1.5 GHz, and it also has a dedicated GPU as well as 1 GB of RAM. In practical terms, this means that basically every game up through PS1 will run almost perfectly, and you'll also be able to play Nintendo 64, PSP, Dreamcast, and some Nintendo DS as well. Both devices have the same 3.5-inch laminated OCA display with a resolution of 480 by 320 with a 3:2 aspect ratio, which is ideal for Game Boy Advance. They both also have a 3500 mAh battery that results in about 5 or 6 hours of playtime altogether. Some other features that are available on both devices are dual analog sticks, which have clickable L3 and R3 buttons. They also have dual shoulder buttons on each side. And these devices support USB-C charging, and they have stereo speakers as well as a headphone jack. And they also have rumble support for any emulator that takes advantage of that. Now the big difference between the two is the price. So the RG351M is $140, and it comes with that internal Wi-Fi and metal shell I mentioned. And the RG351P retails for about $100, but you can get it as low as $85, and often it's packed in with a Wi-Fi USB dongle. So to get the Wi-Fi USB dongle working, you need an OTG adapter, which is basically a USB-C to USB-A adapter, and then you need to plug in your Wi-Fi adapter. They don't really sell any USB-C Wi-Fi adapters. So this is what it's going to look like when you're trying to connect online with an RG351P. Not the prettiest thing in the world. And even then, when you connect it to the internet, you're going to hear like a little bit of a crackling sound coming out of the speakers. Now by contrast, the RG351M has a built-in Wi-Fi chip, so you don't have to worry about having any dongles, and it doesn't make any of those crackling sounds when you connect to a network. Now like I mentioned, performance is going to be exactly the same here, so it doesn't matter what game you're playing, it's going to be the same. And you can also install the exact same firmware on both of these, so if you want to use ArcOS or 351elec, some of these various custom firmwares, you can do it on either device. Now the buttons on these devices are exactly the same. They kind of have a mushy approach, and what I mean by that is that when you push down on them, you have to push down on them a little bit hard. It's very similar to classic Nintendo controllers like the NES or Super Nintendo. And the D-pad is very similar in that way as well. It has what they call a mushy feel as opposed to a clicky feel to it, so it feels a lot like an NES gamepad. The analog sticks are modeled after the Nintendo Switch, so they are very similar to that if you've ever used a Switch before. I'm not in love with these analog sticks, but they work. Down below you see the stereo speakers, a slot for your micro SD card, and a reset button. On the left side you just have a power button, and up top you're going to see your shoulder button, so your L1, L2, R1, R2, and then an OTG adapter that you can plug in things, and then also your charging port, which is on the right, and then your headphone jack in the middle. I'm not a huge fan of these shoulder buttons. They're just kind of clicky, and I don't like them all being in a row like this, but they work and they serve their purpose. Personally, I would rather have stacked shoulder buttons, kind of like triggers. And then on the right side, you can see there's a volume wheel here. Now I have a very early model of the RG351P, and if you look here, the volume wheel is actually very far inside the case, so it doesn't stick out or anything like that. It's kind of hard to actually turn up and down, and I really like that because I never accidentally push it. On the back you can see that the whole device has a little bit of a texture to the plastic, which I really like, and then it has these two rubber pads, which honestly I don't really ever notice. Now even though the components are the same on the RG351M, pushing down on the buttons is a different experience, and that's because the metal shell makes it feel like a much more solid device. So when you push on these buttons and when you push on the D-pad, it gives you a little bit more resistance, and it definitely has a more premium feel to it. The analog sticks are the exact same experience, but the buttons themselves are a little bit different. You may notice on the sides they're actually plastic, it's not metal, and that's to help with the Wi-Fi antenna. Other than that, everything is the same. The only other difference that I'm going to point out is that you can see that the volume wheel sticks out a little bit more on this device. And again, I don't think this was done on purpose, I just think that there's variations in the manufacturing process with these. And honestly, the way this wheel is right here, it doesn't really bother me. I don't think it's a bad thing. So going back to these buttons again, the experience is good, like it feels good with either device. I do prefer the feel with the RG351M. It does feel like a more premium experience, and that's because of that metal shell that you press down on. I don't think it's a deal breaker either way, but it's just something I wanted to make note of. Now when it comes to these screens, they both look very good. They're OCA laminated, which means there's no gap between the glass and the LCD panel itself. I'm not a huge fan of the 3:2 aspect ratio they used for this device, and that's mostly because only Game Boy Advance games look very good on this. Most other classic systems were built with a 4:3 aspect ratio in mind, which means that when you stretch it to a full screen display on the RG351 devices, it looks a little bit squished. So you have to make a decision. Do you want to use full screen and have it a little bit squished, or do you want to have 4:3 with a little bit of black bars on the sides like you see here? Alright, so let's get inside these devices and see if we can find anything else that's different. Both of these devices use Torx screws, and surprisingly there's a lot of variation in the type of screws they use. Both of mine work with the Torx T5 screwdriver, but I've heard reports from other people where T4 and T6 have worked instead. You can see here they're actually different length screws between the two devices. The RG351P is a little bit longer. In order to open up the RG351P, you have to slide your fingernail across the bottom and the sides in order to get all the clips undone. It takes a little bit of practice, but it's pretty easy. Now by contrast, the RG351M doesn't have any clips or anything. You just have to open it up. And you can see here the back plate has these clips on the 351P, and there are no clips on the 351M. So in that case, the 351M is a lot easier to get inside of. Now looking at the board, you probably see one major difference, and that's on the top right. And then also on the bottom left, you can see that the Wi-Fi chips. Now I have an older RG351P, which came with the internal Wi-Fi chip, and you can see here I shielded the speaker cable with some tinfoil and electrical tape. It's a total hack job, but it definitely lessens some of that crackling that you get through the speaker. And up here on the board, you can see it's labeled, it's RG351P version 1.2 from August 7th, 2020. And here's my Wi-Fi chip here, and you can see that it's just a terrible hack job. At this point it works, so I'm a little afraid to take it apart and try to fix it. I'm just going to leave it how it is. Now looking at the RG351M here, you can see that extra chip that's up here. And this chip is actually a stereo power amplifier. And I think this is what they use in order to fix that crackling sound with the Wi-Fi. It's pretty cool to look at, but I honestly don't really know how that stuff works. I'm just happy that it doesn't make the crackling sound. So underneath this ribbon cable here, you'll actually find the version number of the board. And you can see here it's an RG351 version 2.0 that was made in November 24th of 2020. And then obviously the Wi-Fi chip is a little bit different looking, and it also is much cleaner because it doesn't have a bunch of tinfoil and electrical tape on it. So it looks very nice and clean. Honestly, this board just looks very nice. While I have it open, I'll just point out a couple things here just to kind of help you understand what's going on inside. So you can see both of them have the same ribbon cables and setup for their analog sticks, as well as their display ribbon cable. And this big metal thing in the center houses the CPU as well as the RAM. I think it's supposed to function as a heat shield to keep it from overheating. Below that, you can see the little rumble motor. The one on the RG351P has a little pad on it, where the RG351M one doesn't have it. And finally, connected to the Wi-Fi chip is a Wi-Fi antenna, and you can just see the little wire coming up here, and then it attaches to the plastic side here. There's an antenna there on each side. And it's the same setup for both devices. Okay, so let's put everything back together now. So when it comes down to it, that's the extent of all the differences in these two devices. I don't think either device is perfect. I would have preferred a 4:3 aspect ratio for both of these screens, and I would have liked a higher resolution display like in the RG350M. But I think that the chipset is powerful enough for most of the retro gaming you're going to want to do, and both of them have the ability to go online and take advantage of some of those features, for example retro achievements, net play, or online updates. Now obviously $40 is a very large price difference between the metal shell and the Wi-Fi chip that you get with the RG351M. And honestly, if you already own an RG351P, I don't think it's worth that upgraded cost. To me, the RG351P just has a lot more value to it, and I don't think having to use a Wi-Fi dongle is the end of the world. On top of that, you can actually install an internal Wi-Fi chip onto your device, and I have a written guide for that on my website. And another thing I believe, and I may be alone in this, is I think that retro games play better on a plastic device. because that's what we used originally. We had these crappy plastic controllers and we used plastic handheld devices, and this reminds me of that experience, and I really enjoy that. Now on the flip side, the RG351M feels like an elevated version of that retro gaming experience. When you're holding it in your hands and when you're playing it, you know that you're playing it better than it's ever been played before. You're having a premium experience with these classic games, and that contrast is kind of fun too. I'm just not sure it's worth an additional $40. To me, the plastic device of the RG351P and the sub $100 price range is a no-brainer. I think it's probably your best bang for your buck. And you're going to be able to play a ton of retro games, thousands of them, tens of thousands of games on this device. And given its lower price point, I don't mind throwing it in my pocket and banging it up a little bit because it's less than $100 to replace it. I mean, to give you some context, I've owned my RG351P for about 4 months now, and it has all sorts of nicks and dings on it, and I don't really mind because this thing costs less than $100 to replace, and it's not that big of a deal when this thing gets all beat up and worn out. Now the RG351M is kind of a different story. I feel like I need to baby this device. This isn't something that I feel like I could drop on accident or something like that. I'm worried it's going to get dented and it's going to look terrible or get scratched up. So yes, it's a very premium product, but I'm not sure that premium is the thing I want to go for when I'm playing retro games. Sure, I want something to feel good and I want it to play all the games I want, but I don't need to feel like it's a luxury item that I'm using. Now, if you have a loved one that loves retro gaming and you want to give them something really nice that will really impress them, I think the RG351M would be a better gift in that sense. But when it comes to everyday use, in my opinion, I think the RG351P is a better bet. Alright everyone, that's it for this video. I hope this was really helpful for you. At the end of the day, there's not a lot of differences between these two devices, but the price difference is pretty significant. And personally, I'm going to go with the RG351P every single time. I don't think that the features that are available on the 350M are worth that 40% price increase. But let me know what you think. Do you think it's worth it? Leave a comment below and tell me what you think. As always, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.